So this time I decided to make a video about my horror game history. I've made back in 2021 a video about my gaming history in general, and I've also made my history, more recently, my history with Alone in the Dark games. But I'm really surprised I haven't made this video earlier, but I'll definitely have to do this, because if I have to choose, horror games are my favorite genre of games. Of course, I like so many kind of games and genres: sports games, platformers, racing games, puzzle games, puzzle adventure games more like. The games I really don't like are pretty much real-time strategy games, and nowadays I don't really like role-playing games that much either. But anyway, this will be, I think, quite a long video, but let's see how long this will be. There will be a lot of talking, and that's why I have my icy water glass that I will be consuming during this video. Also, this video is testing of my, well, already couple of years old, almost 3-year-old iPhone SE second generation. So I haven't made many videos with my iPhone, but this will be also a kind of testing how the video looks and sounds with my iPhone, that I, like I said, haven't made many videos of, if at all. This could be the first one, I can't remember. Anyway, so this horror gaming history video will mainly focus on PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 days, because those are my most, precious and important eras of gaming in general, and also horror gaming. And I will be talking a little bit about more recent horror games, of course, but this will definitely focus on old school horror games, PS1, PS2 era. But let's begin with, and let's go back to very early 19s. And also, I try my best to, talk about games in chronological order, but it will be a really challenging, so I might not be able to do that very correctly, but anyway, I'll try at least. But yeah, my very first memories with horror games were, like I have said, on my Alone in the Dark history video. It was actually the first Alone in the Dark I played back when the game was pretty new. Still wasn't that new, but I think it was like maybe 93 or 94. The game was released in 92, if I remember right. But yeah, 93, 94, around that time, I first played Alone in the Dark with my cousin's old DOS based PC. Of course, there wasn't Windows at that time, but yeah, DOS operated PC, and I fell in love with the game immediately. Like, yeah, that was so new to me. Like, I was fucking scared shitless playing that game, but yeah, it just I get drawn to it very easily, and I almost immediately realized that horror games are really my thing, my style of games. And there wasn't many horror games back then, as you may know. So horror was still kind of new thing in gaming back in early 90s. But when we got closer to mid-90s, the horror games were really started to be a big thing. And of course, after the Alone in the Dark, I heard about the game, a little game called Resident Evil on PlayStation. I still didn't have my own PlayStation back then when I heard about the game, if I remember right. But yeah, I heard about the Resident Evil game from my school friend back when I was I think in 8th or 9th class. So I was 14 or 15. 15 I think I was. So it was 96, yeah. 96 when I heard about Resident Evil from my friend at school, and I visited him. He wanted to show me his PlayStation. I still didn't have my own PlayStation back then, but I was blown away about the PlayStation, and he showed me Tekken and Mortal Kombat and other early PlayStation games. Actually, I think he didn't have Resident Evil, but yeah, I'm not sure, but maybe he had played that on his friend's place or something, but he, as I remember, he didn't actually have the game. But yeah, he told me that it's, when I told him about the Alone in the Dark, he knew about the game, and he immediately said that, oh, there's some new horror game that really sounds like Alone in the Dark, but is much more, you know, scary and looks more realistic and just better in general. So yeah, when I got my PlayStation finally in very early 97, I think in February, but very early 97, of course I got myself Resident Evil. But it was director's cut, not the actual original version. It was the director's cut. It was still, I think, brand new game back then when I got the Resident Evil director's cut. And yeah, the rest is history. I just fell in love with it immediately, but also I remember the game being fucking hard as hell because of course I wasn't used to games like that. Only Alone in the Dark, but even Alone in the Dark seemed much easier back then to me than Resident Evil. But yeah, and we take turns with my cousin playing the original Resident Evil, because we were so sucking at that game that we just keep dying. The basic zombies just kept killing us, and we take turns. Okay, you're dead, I'm next. Now you're dead, I'm next. But yeah, we are taking turns and tried our best to, you know, progress in the game. And it took some days or even weeks to really get the grips of the game, that what it was all about, and really learn it how to play it. But yeah, at first it was just so damn hard. But yeah, and of course, after the Resident Evil, yeah, I got the Resident Evil 2 demo disc with the director's cut. So, and back then, Resident Evil 2 wasn't still out, so it was still an upcoming game, and the demo just blew me away. The demo of Resident Evil 2, that game with the director's cut. I mean, I immediately saw that the game was kind of very different from the first Resident Evil. It opened with the street, and of course where the actual game starts. There's already, right from the get-go, there are like 3 or 4 zombies approaching you. That was like fist to the face, like this is real thing, this is starting with the bang. And I was already, you know, stressing out, and I think they were actually killing me right from the start of the demo, because Resident Evil 1 started very calmly, you know. But yeah, Resident Evil 2 starts with the bang. The zombies are right from the start attacking you. But yeah, the demo was awesome. Yeah, when I got to the RPD, Raccoon Police Department, in the demo, I was immediately like, okay, this looks much more familiar. Like, it of course resembled me of the mansion from the first game. And yeah, and after a little bit exploration with RBD, the demo ended, and I was like, I fucking need this game. Like, this is even so much better, scarier, plays better, everything's better than Resident Evil 1. And yeah, when I got the game, whew, that was a blast. Like, and even today, well, my opinions have changed over the time. Sometimes I thought about that the first Resident Evil is actually better than Resident Evil 2, but nowadays I can't decide. They are very different, and it's very hard to compare those, because the settings and everything is, the mood, it's just so different to me. But they are equally good. And yeah, after Resident Evil 2, I heard there were coming Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and heard about this monster that chases you relentlessly. And yeah, I was really, when the game finally was out, I was so hooked to that I just wanted to play it from the start to the end with one sitting, but I kind of forced me to take breaks, and in the end I think I played it from the start to finish in about 3 or 4 days, because I forced myself. I can't just, you know, play this from I know it's weird, but I just wanted it to artificially, you know, lengthen the game and make it a longer experience. So I forced myself to take breaks, only play about a couple of hours per day. But yeah, that was, you know, at least as good as Resident Evil 2. And yeah, and like I'm going to say that I'm only going to talk about the most, you know, most important horror games for me. So I'm definitely not going to talk about all the games. Oh hell no, that would be impossible mission. But so next I heard about a Capcom making a Resident Evil style game, but the theme was dinosaurs. So you guess it was the first Dino Crisis. I bought it as a brand new game, and I fell in love with it. Like, it resembled, of course, Resident Evil, same maker, Shinji Mikami. I think he was a director of that game. And, you know, it was weird. I've never really been before a big fan of dinosaurs. I was not big fan of Jurassic Park movies, let's say that, or the original. Yeah, I had seen that, but I was not big fan of dinosaurs in general. But yeah, Dino Crisis was just fucking awesome game. You know, mixing the Resident Evil mechanics with very different setting, and those dinosaurs were fucking relentless. Like, they were not zombies, they were totally different, not slow moving zombies. They were fucking fast, and the game was much more stress inducing than Resident Evil games. But it made it so much different and so fresh that it felt so different, and I liked that, because I didn't want a exact copy of Resident Evil. And then I think before Dino Crisis 2, there were a very, very important horror game on PlayStation 1 that I bought after Dino Crisis, I think, was Parasite Eve 2. I didn't play Parasite Eve 1 because it was never released in Europe, the PAL version. But the sequel was released in PAL this time, and I just love it, that game. Like, it was very Resident Evil style, but, you know, incorporated some RPG elements to it Of course, it was made by Square Soft, back when it was called Squaresoft, not Square Enix. The makers of Final Fantasy series, so you could definitely see some influence from Final Fantasy series. But it was more focused, of course, on survival horror than role-playing. But yeah, there were role-playing elements, and I just love it, you know, especially the locations in Parasite Eve. The early, you know, city and the dry field, the Mojave Desert. That's my favorite area of the game. Just unbelievable area, location, so cozy, but yet so scary. Maybe the later areas wasn't that interesting, you know, the lab and, you know, the last area or the latter areas, but the first two areas was just phenomenal. And yeah, that is still, you know, on par with the Resident Evil games on PlayStation 1. I think it's as good as the first three Resident Evils, the Parasite Eve 2. But yeah, I think after that, Dino Crisis got sequel, but it was okay, but for me, it was definitely not on par with Dino Crisis 1. I liked Dino Crisis 1 much more, and shout out to Joel. I know your opinion is very different. You like Dino Crisis 2 much more, and if I remember right, you kind of hate the Dino Crisis 1, but yeah, to me it's opposite. Like, I think Dino Crisis 1 is in every way. Okay, maybe graphics are better on Dino Crisis 2, yeah. And I would say overall gameplay is much faster. So I could say the gameplay is maybe better and graphics, but in any other category, Dino Crisis, the original, wins for me. That was pretty much the end of PlayStation 1 here. Of course, how can I forget? Sorry, I almost did a very big mistake for not remembering, of course, fucking Silent Hill 1. Like, that is still one of the most scariest horror games for me, still, and it's my favorite Silent Hill game, the very first. So, but in chronologically, I think I purchased that about in the same time as I was playing Resident Evil 3, I think. I didn't buy it immediately when it was brand new, but a little bit later, in 2000, I think. But yeah, the game, unlike Resident Evils, which were just hard, and I was having issues playing them because they were hard, but in Silent Hill, from the very first hour or half an hour, the issue was that the game wasn't just hard, it was fucking scary. Like, I was getting very anxious and scared of the game from the very intro of the game, where you chase Cheryl to the, you know, to the corridor and, you know, the lights go out and you take a lighter, and that was horrifying back then. That was fucking horrifying. And I thought about when, of course, you need to die in that intro, then you wake up in the cafe and there's Sybil, the female cop. You have a conversation with, but yeah, like after that intro, I was not able, I kid you not, I was not able to continue the game. Like, I was just thinking, okay, this is too scary. I can't continue playing this. Maybe later, but right now, I just can't. This is too much. And I had to build the courage for like a couple of weeks to really continue playing the game. Like, so yeah, it took about 1 to 2 weeks to really be able to continue the game after the shocking intro for me. And yeah, so, and of course, okay, I'm pretty sure I will be forgetting some games in this video, but yeah, still, I'm still staying on the PlayStation 1 era. There were, of course, Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare on PlayStation 1, which was a very dear, very important game to me because, of course, my very first survival horror experience was original Alone in the Dark. And I immediately fell in love. I just thought about, okay, this is taking some influences from the Resident Evil games, but it still feels like Alone in the Dark game. And to this day, well, let's just say Alone in the Dark series is very inconsistent. It's not very balanced. There are really awful games and there are very good ones like The New Nightmare and of course the original, and Alone in the Dark 3, I really like that in setting in a Wild West. But anyway, so The New Nightmare, it definitely looked that it has been taking influences from the recent Resident Evil games like Resident Evil 2 and 3. But yeah, it still felt like Alone in the Dark game. Very dark setting, it was even more atmospheric than any of the 3 Resident Evil games, I would say, or on par with maybe the first Resident Evil regarding atmosphere. But yeah, very atmospheric game, very hard actually to, you know, it was not perfect, the combat was not perfect, it had some issues, and the game also wasn't that it wasn't that polished, so it was a little bit rough around the edges. But yeah, I was very lucky to, you know, see the continuation back then of the Alone in the Dark series. And now we are moving to the PlayStation 2 era, and my first, I can't remember chronologically which one was the first. Was it Resident Evil Code Veronica, which I've heard earlier that it was initially only for Dreamcast, that I couldn't play it because I never had Dreamcast and I never really... Well, there was some time I was thinking about getting Dreamcast, but you know what happened to Dreamcast a little bit later. I'm pretty happy that I didn't get it. But you know, nowadays I really regret maybe a little bit that I didn't buy Dreamcast, because it's fucking awesome console even though I never had it. Yeah, so it was either Resident Evil Code Veronica or Extermination. I think first it was Extermination, like the sci-fi survival horror games setting were very familiar to the Thing movie set in Antarctica. I fucking loved that game, and it's alongside Resident Evil Code Veronica, it's my favorite survival horror games from PlayStation 2 days, definitely. The only thing that really little bit not ruined but didn't make it perfect was the last boss of Extermination. That was a little bit shite, to be honest. The difficulty of that boss was just, you know, it was unfair, I could say, even. But other than that, the game was brilliant, great atmosphere, great gameplay. Yeah, like I said, reminiscent so much of it. Like that almost felt like The Thing, the game. Of course, there was a game, The Thing, the video game on PlayStation 2 later, a couple of years later, but and I also got that game, but I'm not really going to talk about that game much, because that game was a kind of big disappointment to me being a huge The Thing fan, the movie. But yeah, back to Resident Evil Code Veronica. That game was and still is unbelievably good, and sometimes I have said that it may be my favorite Resident Evil game. I'm not really sure. It's definitely there on top, one of the best ones. Yeah, it was somehow different because the camera angles weren't just static anymore. The graphics were all 3D and not pre-rendered. That was new, but still the camera angles were more or less the same as the old ones, but with the moving camera and all. But they didn't really change the mechanic that much of the gameplay. It was still very familiar to old Resident Evil games on PS1. Yeah, it's an excellent game that I was really happy that it got a PlayStation 2 port, because I would have missed that game if it were, staying as a Dreamcast exclusive. But yeah, PlayStation 2 was too hot of a console not to get the port of the Resident Evil game, Code Veronica back then. So it had to have its own version, and I'm so happy that it got ported to PlayStation 2. Then what other survival horror games there really were on PlayStation 2 on the early. Of course, there were Silent Hill games like Silent Hill 2, of course, quite early PS2 survival horror game, and yeah, it was just awesome. Like, the realism of the graphics back then just blew me away, like all the facial expressions and everything, comparing to the PlayStation 1 Silent Hill 1, which, like I said, is still my favorite, but Silent Hill 2 was just so big step up from the first game, graphically, gameplay, still kind of very similar to the first game, but different. Well, locations were pretty similar, I think. But yeah, the psychological, aspect, they just improved that even more from the first game. So Silent Hill 2 is kind of mind-fucking game. Like, still today, to me, some moments and scenes of the game is just hard to grasp what really happens. Of course, nowadays I know the whole story pretty much, but it was really hard to understand sometimes what the fuck were happening in the game. It was so heavily psychological, much more than the first Silent Hill. Then Silent Hill 3 game, which were more or less the same than Resident Evil 2. You could even say that it's one of the weakest points is that it's too much like Silent Hill 2. But it was equally as good to me, in my opinion. But yeah, maybe too similar. But yeah, I like it that the playing character this time was female, a teenager girl, and not male character like in Silent Hill 1 and 2. So that was quite refreshing and new to have a female protagonist. But yeah, the scary factor regarding that, I still think Silent Hill 3 may be the scariest. Not the best for me, but the scariest Silent Hill, maybe. It was definitely more scary than the Silent Hill 2. I know there are many opinions that say Silent Hill 2 is the scariest one or best one, but I don't think so. I think Silent Hill 3 is a little bit scarier than the second. Then there was Silent Hill 4, The Room, and that was a whole different game. Like, you could see they tried to renew the series, kind of reboot of the series, while it was not talked about as a reboot, but yeah, like, that was too different. It had some good moments. It was not that bad, actually. I enjoyed it on some parts, and on some other parts I didn't. But it was, after all, quite mediocre, comparing to the high standards of the first 3 Silent Hill games. It was definitely up there with those first 3. It was definitely worse. But still, I would say pretty good in my opinion. And then I would skip to the GameCube, as I heard that there will be a remake of the first Resident Evil, and like I remember seeing the first gameplay videos of Resident Evil remake on GameCube. I was like, wow, is this like real thing? Is this real life? Like the animations and just graphics, they look at phenomenal. Like it had so deep, like the locations were of course familiar because it was a remake of the first game, but it looked and felt so different because the graphics were so leaps ahead than the, of course, PlayStation 1 graphics. And yeah, I would say maybe, I'm on the fence, it's either Resident Evil Code Veronica or the remake on GameCube from the first game, my favorite Resident Evil game. But yeah, the remake is just absolutely phenomenal, like yeah, brilliant, phenomenal, astonishing game. Then after that, GameCube got Resident Evil Zero, the prequel to the first game, and it had its good moments. It's definitely a good game in my opinion. Not as bad as many others say it is. Of course, it's not on par with Resident Evil 1 remake, but it's still, I would say, very good Resident Evil game in my opinion. You know, the train part, the beginning part, and the training facility which resembles of the mansion from the first game, they were excellent areas, excellent locations of the game. But pretty much the, you know, like many others think, the, you know, switching characters between Billy and Rebecca is pretty exhausting and tiring and just kind of pointless. Why didn't they make it just, you know, you alone exploring and going through the game, and not like two characters which you can just leave other character in some room and continue with others? And it was just pretty pointless to me. I didn't really see the reason for that mechanic, and I'm sure many of you agrees with that. Then Resident Evil 4 was made, and that's a huge milestone on the Resident Evil series, and I think it's pretty fucking awesome game. Yet again, like Silent Hill The Room, which tried to, you know, renew the series. Same thing happened with Resident Evil 4. It was totally different. You could see that, okay, Capcom wants to move in a very different direction, more to action, but not entirely forgetting the horror elements. I think Resident Evil 4 still has very memorable horror moments like regenerators and stuff like that, and some boss fights. So yeah, Resident Evil 4 is a milestone game that really is considered one of the best games in the series, and I can see why. But still, I prefer more survival horror oriented Resident Evils. But if you just play Resident Evil 4 as just an, you know, action horror game and not, you know, taking it as a serious Resident Evil game, I think you can enjoy that game better. But if you constantly comparing it to old school Resident Evil games, that could ruin your experience a little bit. But yeah, so yeah, a big milestone game that really paved the way to the newer Resident Evil games. And so I think I will be skipping. Of course, there was some nice survival horror games on PlayStation 3, but I think I will skip this because this video is getting quite long. So I will have to skip PlayStation 3 because I can't really remember that many games. Of course, there was Resident Evil 5 and 6 on PlayStation 3, but none of those games, like Resident Evil 5 is still quite okay, but Resident Evil 6 is just quite shite to me. It's only good in cooperation, playing with your friend locally. I think that's its only good point. And same goes with Resident Evil 5. They are both made for cooperative play, I think. But yeah, so then I'll skip to Resident Evil 7, which is quite a difference maker. Of course, at first I was really cautious and just skeptical about, okay, it's being from the first person view, that is maybe too different. I'm not sure about this. Can this really work? But in the end, I freaking loved Resident Evil 7. It was a great reboot. Like, it even, I mean, it kind of succeeded mixing the feel of the old school Resident Evil games, the first 3 and Code Veronica, the feeling, the survival horror elements, and mixing that with the, you know, Resident Evil 4 kind of some elements, you know, mainly maybe the setting and things like that were more towards Resident Evil 4. But it was a great mix of both worlds, the very old school Resident Evils and the style of Resident Evil 4, mainly the, you know, graphical style and, you know, settings, theme. Then a great, brilliant news hit the world that there will be a remake of the so much anticipated Resident Evil 2 on PlayStation 4. And yeah, I remember seeing the trailer on E3 of Resident Evil 2 remake. Like, that is, even if it's very recent memory still, it's one of the best memories and moments of my whole Resident Evil my whole Resident Evil like moment history and history in general. Like I was so fucking excited. Yeah, that was like my pulse was racing like hell. I was so excited, and you know, the game ended up being just fucking brilliant. As good as, of course, different, but as good as the remake of the first Resident Evil, if not even better. It's just, you know, great, brilliant example of modernized Resident Evil done right. And after that, a little bit later, Resident Evil 3 was announced that it will also get remake. Of course, that wasn't so big impact because it pretty much followed the same style of remake than the second game. And it wasn't as good as the remake of the RE2 because it had for some reason, very weird cut content. There was no clock tower, only the surrounding area where the boss fight took place, and there wasn't Raccoon Park either, and there was just missing content, and that was like, okay, nowadays I'm not so pissed about it anymore, but back then I was like, why cutting these locations that were fans' favorites? I mean, I believe almost every fan loved the clock tower area, and maybe as many loved the Raccoon Park area. It was maybe proof, but the Raccoon Park was awesome area. But yeah, the clock tower was fucking phenomenal, scary little place. But yeah, then after Resident Evil 3 remake, the newest Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 8 Village, that is almost as good, I would say on par with Resident Evil 7. So it continued, of course, the style of first-person survival horror in a style of Resident Evil 7. So 8 Village follows that, but adds more action to it and even more influence from the Resident Evil 4, definitely. It feels some places very familiar to Resident Evil 4. So yeah, almost 1 hour I've talked about, of course, mainly, it's not a surprise, I mainly talk about Resident Evil games because it's my favorite horror game series. But yeah, like now in about 2 months we will get Resident Evil 4 remake, which I'm not as excited about as I was about the Resident Evil 1 remake back in GameCube days, early 2000, and not even more as excited as back in when Resident Evil 2 remake was announced. I was definitely in those cases more excited, but still, of course, I'm going to get Resident Evil 4 remake. don't get me wrong, of fucking course I will. So 24th of March, Resident Evil 4 remake will be released on PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4. It will not get the last gen Xbox support, so it will only be on Series X and S consoles and PC. But yeah, both PlayStations 4 and 5. I will get it, of course, for my PlayStation 5. And a little bit bonus content in the end of this video. I will give a little bit honorable mentions to some games that I want to just at least a little bit talk about, that I didn't talk about. The game that was released in very late PlayStation 2 era called Cold Fear, which was made by Darkworks, the same team that made Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare. And if I remember right, Cold Fear was their last game, unfortunately. But the premise was very interesting. The setting was in a ship in the ocean, and on the ship there were zombies, and it was very similar in a gameplay mechanic wise as Resident Evil 4. It definitely was very similar to Resident Evil 4. And I remember those games coming around the same time, so, and actually I can't remember which one was first. Was Resident Evil 4 released before Cold Fear or vice versa? Anyway, pretty good game. I liked it and I wanted to buy it because one reason was that I so freaking loved Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, and I heard it was made by the same team, so I wanted to support them, and also very curious to see what they were doing after Alone in the Dark, New Nightmare. And then some mention about Project Zero games, better known as Fatal Frame games on US. The ghost hunting, psychological horror games, they were more focused on puzzle solving and just atmosphere building and, you know, capturing ghosts with your camera. I have played the first 3 games, Project Zero 1, 2 and 3, and I bought recently the remake or remaster of the Project Zero 5, Maiden of the Blackwater, if I remember right. I never played the 4th game because I think it's only for, if I remember right, for Nintendo Wii, the 4th game. But yeah, Project Zero series is pretty okay, and especially the first 2 games, and especially the very first Project Zero is fucking scary. It's even maybe on the same level as the scariness and you know, anxiety levels are on the par with, to me, on the par with Silent Hill 1. Like, yeah, there were moments that I couldn't, like it was a challenge to continue playing the first Project Zero. But after, you know, the first one, I played the second one, Crimson Butterfly. I already got used to the, you know, game and the ghosts, and it wasn't as scary as in the first game, where very first ghosts appeared. It was kind of stressful and anxious and quite scary, to be honest. But yeah, I already got used to them by the time I played the second game, and the same, it even got easier with the Project Zero 3 and of course 5. Well, I could mention the game that I have played and I owned it, but there's nothing much to say about the game actually, because there is not very much good to talk about it. It's the original Xbox exclusive Dino Crisis 3. Yeah, in space. Like, it was not all horrible. It had some great moments, or not great, but it had some good moments. Graphics were definitely pretty good back in the day, and of course it was the most powerful console back then. Graphics were great, but yeah, just gameplay and oh my god, the camera angle were fucking bad. It messed so much your head that it almost ruined the whole fucking game. Fucking camera angles, for fuck's sake. But yeah, gameplay wasn't that great either. But yeah, I would say graphics, story was okay. The setting, I mean, in space, I love sci-fi. I love sci-fi mixed with horror. So in that sense, I maybe should have liked it more than I actually did. But yeah, not much to say about Dino Crisis 3, and there's a reason why it never got newer games. Like, that was full stop, the end of Dino Crisis series. And there has been some rumors and talked about the reviving Dino Crisis series, but nothing is confirmed. But what is confirmed is the, you know, there will be a new Silent Hill game. Actually, I think 2 new Silent Hill games. Of course, Silent Hill 2 remake is coming maybe this year, finally. Maybe we'll get the kind of similar, you know, similar kind of remake than Resident Evil 2 got with the Silent Hill 2 remake. But in addition to that, there will be a whole new Silent Hill, I think, called Ascension, Silent Hill Ascension. But we don't know much about that at this moment. But yeah, and also new reboot of the Alone in the Dark, but I've mentioned that. I've made a video about that quite recently. So I'm really excited about new reboot of the Alone in the Dark. Yeah, new Silent Hill 2 remake coming, Resident Evil 4 remake coming. Ooh, there will be a great year. This year will be a very important and very good for survival games, survival horror games, especially to the classic series like Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, Silent Hill. Anyway, yeah, about an hour talking, little more than an hour, but yeah, I'm finished now. I hope I didn't forget to mention about some important games that I would have liked to talk about and cover a little bit. But yeah, that's pretty much, could I say, I could have talked so much more, you know. I could have made this a 2 hour, even fucking 3 hour long video. But this is my survival horror game history in a nutshell, believe it or not. I tried to make this as short as possible, but yeah, I knew that this will be at least 1 hour, and I was pretty accurate. But anyway, I hope you liked this video. I think this is now my longest video in my channel, but yeah, this will be a quite, you know, there will not be these long videos very often, I can assure you. There may be in the future, but yeah, this is I just knew that this would be a very long video because there's so much to talk about the survival horror games that were important to me that I have played in my history. But yeah, really looking forward to the future also. Not just remembering the good old days, but I'm glad that I can be very hopeful for the future also of survival horror games, whether it be new IPs or just remakes of the old classics. It doesn't matter. Of course, I always it's very welcomed, warmly welcomed to me if they make remakes of the classic games that were so important to me, you know, in my childhood and teenage years and early adult days. But yeah, enough. Just trying to conclude this video with something wise to say, but I can't think of anything. Anyway, this was my history of survival horror games and a little bit looking forward to the future and being hopeful of the survival horror games future. Right. See you in the next one. It's a bye. Bye bye.